Thank you very much. We'll open the 7th plenary session, which is the de facto, if not the de jure concluding session of the Shangri-La Dialogue. It allows the ministers to offer some reflections from their national point of view, but perhaps pick up a couple of points that they've heard during these 3 days. And in the question and answer period that I'll operate after this plenary is concluded, I invite interventions or thoughts that are general, not just specific to those that have been inspired by our excellent panel. In the last session, we had 2 heads of government and 1 minister. We're trying to keep up the altitude, and we have 2 deputy prime ministers and 1 minister, and really delighted to have, again, General Banh, the deputy prime minister and minister of national defense of Cambodia. I promised him at dinner on the first evening that I might have time later next year to make my first visit to Cambodia, one of the rare countries in the Indo-Pacific that I haven't yet had an opportunity to visit. Richard Marles, the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Defense of Australia, for his 2nd consecutive appearance at the IISS Shangri-La Dialogue. His first was last year, only 3 weeks after he had taken up his post as Defense Minister, and we're delighted that he's coming back for a return match with an extra 372 days of training, and of course, particularly honored, and as is customary, to have Dr. Ung En Hen, the Minister of Defense of Singapore, offer his important strategic reflections on Indo-Pacific strategy and cooperative security. And so with that, could I please invite the Deputy Prime Minister of Cambodia to take the floor? Thank you, sir.
Your Excellency, Dr. John Chipman, Excellencies, distinguished delegates. First and foremost, I would like to express my sincere appreciation to the International Institute for Strategic Studies for granting me this opportunity to share my perspective regarding developing models for cooperative security in such a crucial forums. I would also like to thank the government and the Ministry of Defense of Singapore for the warm hospitality towards myself and my delegations. At the early stage of the COVID-19 pandemics, we could not fully appreciate the scale of destruction and the effects that it would have on our society. It is apparent that the COVID-19 pandemics was a disaster that we will never forget. We acknowledge that we are unbelievably underprepared to manage the situation. Nevertheless, in the end, we have triumphed over this pandemic through practical measures and a broad scope of cooperation. For Cambodia, a nationwide response mechanism was formulated and rigorously led by Samdech Prime Minister Hun Sen. Through concentrating our workforce resources and harnessing the commitment of our officials from all levels, our armed forces, and our people throughout the country. Samdech Hun Sen has also highlighted the balance between national security and humanitarian compassion. This led to the decision to allow MS Westerdam to dock in Sihanoukville amidst the peak of the COVID-19 pandemics, when her requests to dock in numerous places were denied. I believe that this event is a great example that Cambodia has set in terms of humanity in discriminations, assisting each other, and not being self-preserved during pandemic. With regards to comprehensive cooperation, Cambodia last year initiated a concept paper concerning cooperations amongst the defense forces of ASEAN member states in cross-border pandemic containment. Along with this, Cambodia and Singapore also co-chaired the Phnom Penh Vision on approaches to support the COVID-19 recovery. All of this can be considered a model for the efforts towards encouraging multinational cooperation well in the future, not only in terms of the COVID-19 pandemic, but also with regards to national interests and each other interests simultaneously. Other than the COVID-19 pandemic, we have also been plagued with vigorous regional and global security issues. One vital objective is the collective effort to bring an end to the Russian Ukraine war. Cambodia opposed the use of force by one country against another, state separations, and occupation of a sovereign state. Cambodia believed that the terminations of war require mutual concession, which includes stopping the use of force to solve problems, respect international laws, pausing external encouragement to expand the war, and ceasing economic sanctions. It is evident we do not have any specific models to follow in this situation, other than the acknowledgement that we cannot end war through war. The most suitable choice is to end the bloodshed and return to the negotiation table in the spirits of win-win outcome. As Russia, Ukraine, and other countries in the region will continue to live alongside one another in the region that will continue for hundreds of years in the future. Any solution should focus on honoring each other, and we certainly do not want to see anyone being forced against the wall. Cambodia support all initiatives which provide political solution to end this war, such as China's 12 points initiative to resolve the Russian Ukraine crisis. Cambodia appeals to international community to provide initiative with similar objective to obtain a political settlement. If the fighting continues, both parties will ultimately endure significant losses. Tension between major power has hindered the harmonization and prosperity of other nations. It is obvious that competing parties will not gain any substantial benefit, as it is inevitable that they remain dependent on one another for the long term. Recently, Samdech Techo Prime Minister stated that we do not want to see either China or the US entering decline. The decline of one or both would bring about many risks for the region and the world. As, as a member of ASEAN, Cambodia wishes to see changes in the practice of rival nations from tit for tat to working together in order to achieve shared benefit, stability, and prosperity for the region and the world. We also wish to see the easing of tension and a return to normalcy in the South China Sea, as well as finding an acceptable solution to bring an end to the Russia Ukraine war. The establishment and proceeding of mechanism and partnership introduced by some major country within the region is being judged from different perspectives. It would be a perfect scenario if these mechanisms or partnership serve the purpose of encouraging peace, stability, and prosperity of the region. On the contrary, action that cause destruction to other nations generates tensions within the region, regardless of the reasoning of a strategic balance. On, on the other hand, we need to weigh between transparency and each country's interests. Cambodia has faced the issue of Ream naval base. Certainly, we would provide transparency of our activity to avoid misunderstanding. In the relation to this point, Cambodia has clearly reaffirmed that we respect our law and our constitution. Meanwhile, everyone should understand the requirement of each country, such as the need for military modernization to serve its own interests, as well as to be able to participate in promoting the peace and stability in the region. The situation in Myanmar is a concern that greatly affects ASEAN's credibility as well as ASEAN centrality. In my perspective, the role of ASEAN is very important for the settlement, but success is not guaranteed if there is no true commitment from Myanmar themselves. Finding trust among relevant parties is the key to solving this issue. In Cambodia experience, the win-win policies offer concessions, value, and trust toward one another, which act as a strong foundation for sustainable peace, harmonization, and prosperity. This is another model that is derived from the inevitable combination of political will, national unity, and the pure heartedness of external support, based on the spirits of shared benefits. While there are still internal conflicts and civil war occurring, especially in Africa, causing tremendous humanitarian crisis, peacekeepers are indeed a well-needed element. Acknowledging this, Cambodia is strongly committed to enhance our capability and participation in peacekeeping operation under the United Nations framework in order to help and build harmonization for those in suffering. Notably, last year, Cambodia initiated a concept paper to enhance ASEAN's women's participation in overseas peacekeeping operation. My last point concerns is the issue of climate change. Without a doubt, destruction of our ecosystem and pollution occur all over the world. However, industrialized countries remain a major contributor to climate change. We have witnessed numerous efforts to reduce risk to our Earth. Unfortunately, we have not seen any substantial improvements. We continue to see reports on the climate change situation worsening. Thus, there is a strong necessity for more robust collective effort in this matter, especially from major industrialized nations in setting examples in trying to reduce greenhouse gas and pollution in all forms. Thank you.
Deputy Prime Minister, thank you very much, and I think everyone will have noted in your remarks your commitment to transparency on the facilities that you offer to other countries in your country and your reminder that there remain a number of strategic disruptions in this part of the world for which, to coin a phrase that I used on Friday night, the instruments of strategic peacekeeping must still be found. So with that, could I invite Richard Marles to take the floor? Thank you.
Well, can I thank the International Institute for Strategic Studies for hosting this valuable event, and can I thank you, John, not just for this event today, but for your stewardship of the International Institute for Strategic Studies for more than 3 decades. And can I thank my good friend, Dr. Eng Heng Ung, the Defence Minister of Singapore, and through Eng, all the government of Singapore, for hosting us in such a fantastic way in what is a truly remarkable country. This time last year, I was here at the Shangri-La Dialogue for the first time as Australia's Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Defence. It was just 3 weeks after the Australian Labor government had won the election, and my speech was the government's first national security address. I spoke about Australia taking its place in the world with confidence and renewed commitment to responsible, nuanced and effective statecraft, a determination to harness all arms of national power, to not only ensure Australia's security, but crucially, to help shepherd our Indo-Pacific region through a profound period of strategic change and contest. I spoke about how Australia would invest more in our abiding tide with our Pacific neighbours, how we would revitalise our historically deep engagement with Southeast Asia with ASEAN at its core. And importantly, my address came 5 months after Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, a brutal war that has meant we cannot take the security and prosperity of our region for granted. Some still dismiss Putin's war with a neighbouring state as an issue for Europe. Bizarrely, the Kremlin tries to depict its violent aggression against Ukraine as solidarity with developing countries against an alleged neocolonialism by the West. But the simple truth is that a powerful state is using military force to impose its will upon a less powerful state, contrary to all international law and the UN Charter, which, as a permanent member of the UN Security Council, Russia has a special and a particular responsibility to uphold. The question that haunted me then, and still does a year on, is whether the war in Ukraine is a terminal spasm of Europe's imperial past, as one astute commentator noted, or a forewarning of the contest to come in a post-hegemonic world, where states see opportunity to build a new order according to their preferences, including, if necessary, by military aggression. Putin clearly saw such an opportunity and determined that he would seize it. Australia believes it is vitally important for our collective future that the world concludes from Ukraine's inspiring resistance that Putin's gambit failed, and that the costs of military aggression far outweighed and perceived benefit. But the world won't arrive at this conclusion without effort and investment from us all. Russia's invasion of Ukraine represents a broader failure of the global system to deter the use of force in pursuit of strategic goals. And we must not allow this to become a dangerous new precedent for our own region. A year ago, I observed that China is engaging in the largest conventional military build-up that the world has seen since the end of the Second World War. And this build-up is happening without an explanation of its strategic purpose. China is not providing our region or the world with any strategic reassurance. To be clear, we value a productive relationship with China, and we've sought to stabilise this relationship after a difficult period, Indeed, that process began right here last year with my meeting with former Chinese Defence Minister Wei Fenghe. And since then, both our foreign and trade ministers have visited China, and Prime Minister Albanese and President Xi met last November. Just yesterday, I met with my counterpart, General Li Shangfu. And importantly, our defence dialogue with China has recommenced. These are important steps forward, and we acknowledge that these are steps which China and Australia have taken together. But it's also important that transparency and strategic intent and the purpose of military growth characterise the way nations operate in the Indo-Pacific and, for that matter, the world. And with this in mind, last year I underlined that the purpose of Australia's investment in new defence capability, including through AUKUS, was a prudent and a necessary contribution to a sustainable and inclusive balance of power that both deterred conflict but also reassured states that they never needed to resort to force. Australia's Defence Strategic Review, delivered in April, follows through on the commitments that I made a year ago. What the DSR, as it's known, seeks to do is to put in place a new strategic posture for Australia. At its core, the DSR recognises we must make investments in our defence capabilities now to defend Australia, to deter through denial any attempt to project force against Australia, and protect Australia's economic connection to our region and to the world. We also recognise that we must be able to contribute with our partners to the collective security of the Indo-Pacific and the maintenance of the global and regional rules-based order. Indeed, these are now articulated tasks of Australia's Defence Force. Our government views Australia playing its part in maintaining and building regional peace as being at the heart of why we have a Defence Force. And building on the work we have undertaken over the past 12 months, next year the Australian Government will release our inaugural National Defence Strategy, which we have committed to updating biennially. In developing this strategy, we will continue to be guided by these principles. All of us here know we live in an interdependent world, and that to address the challenges we face, we must work together. As Singapore's Prime Minister Lee set out at the Bao Forum in March, we need to reinforce the resilience of the region by building a dense mesh of cooperation and interdependence. But we also know that interdependence can be weaponised for strategic leverage. And interdependence does not preclude, as once supposed, the devastating prospect of conflict between trading partners. And that is why the subject for this session is so important. We must develop models for cooperative security that don't rely on past assumption and which can adapt to changing strategic circumstances. In delivering the keynote address, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese made clear our region is not a backdrop for the ambition of others, and that the future of the region is not somehow a foregone conclusion. We have our own agency in building our own security. For Australia, the first model for cooperative security is ASEAN and its related EAS and ADMM Plus architecture. No other mechanism brings together the critical group of states that are a prerequisite for any durable strategic equilibrium in our region. And although Australia is not a member, we will always invest in the core meaning and efficacy of ASEAN centrality. ASEAN is a necessary condition for regional security. But the strategic challenges we now face mean that smaller groupings can help complement the central architecture of ASEAN. Regional states, including Australia, can play an important role through smaller groups of countries committed to larger goals. In fact, we've been doing this for a long time. The Five Powers defence arrangements have been contributing to regional security since 1971. And for Australia, these groupings are aimed at achieving specific objectives. AUKUS is a capability and technology partnership. It will not have, and nor will it seek, the normative functions that ASEAN rightly exercises. The Quad is another model for cooperation that is focused on practical engagement beyond defence. Meeting in Japan 2 weeks ago, Quad leaders reaffirmed their commitment to a region where all countries, large and small, have the agency to decide their future and to shape our region. Some would seek to frame groupings like AUKUS and the Quad as blockism, which somehow diminish ASEAN. To the contrary, they show how small groups of countries can work together in support of principles and objectives we all hold so dear. The challenge is to ensure these models of cooperation are not competitive with ASEAN, but rather complementary. And this idea is at the heart of Australia's regional engagement. The Albanese government has taken major steps in the last 12 months when it comes to getting Australia's hard power equation right. In doing so, Australia's defence strategy is contributing to our region's security and prosperity. Our government, led by Prime Minister Anthony Albanese, myself, and our Foreign Minister Penny Wong, has also made engaging with you all, our regional friends and partners, a priority. In announcing the AUKUS nuclear-powered submarine deal, we made more than 60 calls to regional and other world leaders. And in the days leading up to and following the Defence Strategic Review, we made similar calls, while our diplomatic network were active in briefing counterparts across the globe. And while it is for individual countries to judge how successful that effort was, what must be completely clear to all is that the intent on our part is to be as transparent as possible about what we are doing, the way we are doing it, and why. Because a secure region requires balance, and balance requires transparency. So while we will make difficult decisions to enhance our hard power, this will be underlined by diplomacy. Which is why this year's dialogue and those following are so important, not just to Australia's strategic posture, but that of our region. For the Shangri-La dialogue is diplomacy at its best. Diplomacy is not measured by the volume with which friends agree. Rather, its measure is in how tensions are navigated. Substantive discussion always matters, because we live in an age where the world needs diplomatic excellence. For Australia, diplomacy will always be the front line of our engagement with the world, and we will always seek to use diplomacy to create pathways for peace. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Richard, first for your kind words about me and the Shangri-La dialogue, but importantly for the 3 key points that I noted down, that methods of security cooperation need to be developed that do not rely on past assumptions. Secondly, that smaller groupings can help to complement the central architecture of ASEAN. And third, if I may put it this way, another vital epigrammatic point, that a secure region requires balance, and balance requires transparency. Thank you for that strategic thought. With that, the Minister of Defence of Singapore, please. Minister Ng Eng Hee, our host.
Let me, on behalf of my colleagues at the Ministry, Minister Maliki, Foreign Affairs, Senior Minister of State Heng Chee Hao, and Senior Minister of State Zaki Mohammed, thank you all for joining us on this 20th edition of Shangri-La Dialogue. It's personal thanks, and your presence here makes it very special. Let me also take this moment as a personal thanks to John Chipman. He's been here from the start, if you like. In this partnership, I'm not sure who was the paternal and maternal partner, but we'll leave that aside. But thank you for bringing this to the Shangri-La dialogue to greater heights. And indeed, as John mentioned, the Shangri-La dialogue has grown. And now, this year, 48 ministers, starting at 14, and a number of delegates, 600 delegates from more than 40 countries. I thank you for the thanks of the hospitality. It's a great honor to be on the same plenary as Deputy Prime Minister Banh and Richard Marles. And thank you for your compliments, but I know that there will be lapses, especially like many of you countries. We had some manpower disruptions post-COVID, so please excuse us for those. And where we have not been up to standard, we'll improve. But certainly, I think that the staff have been working very hard to make sure that this is a successful SLD. And I think we can all take heart in this expansion of participants as a clear sign that countries recognize the need and value of face-to-face engagements, not only when circumstances and relationships are favorable, but even more so in testing times. And indeed, if there's nothing demonstrated at the Shangri-La dialogue, that there is much geopolitical turmoil, not least because of two significant disruptive events, the COVID-19 pandemic and the unlawful invasion of Ukraine by Russia. What lessons and applications should apply to Asia as we meet? I think the foremost priority of government leaders must be to avoid a physical conflict here, at least for the coming decade, if we are to scope our goals and ambitions. Simultaneous conflicts in Europe and Asia will be disastrous and blight the future for an entire generation. And as leaders, we must do all we can to avoid this nightmarish scenario. I don't think there's anyone here who would disagree with those statements, but unfortunately, the reality and trajectory of geopolitics diverges. Military spending around the world has gone up over the past 2 decades and is expected to rise even further in the coming decade. Global military expenditure reached a high of US 2.2 trillion last year. Central and Western European states spent US 345 billion on defense last year, in real terms surpassing levels that were seen during the Cold War. The obvious stimulant there is the Russian-Ukraine war. But even within the Asia-Pacific region, without any physical conflict, combined military expenditures has increased to US 575 billion, 45% more than a decade ago. Excluding China, defense spending increased by almost 30% to US 283 billion. Military spending is set to grow for the coming decade. By 2030, spending will be nearly $1 trillion for the US and about $500 billion for China. So too middle powers in Asia. US 180 billion for India, Japan to over 60 billion, similar to France then, and around US 40 billion by Australia. By 2030, ASEAN's military spending will increase by 40% to US 130 billion. Increased defense spending per se need not be a sign or source of instability. Indeed, core to defense deterrence, which Singapore practices, is an adequate defense budget that deters aggression. But in the absence of a strategic framework of engagement and mutual restraint, cooperation despite competition, that balance tilts away from deterrence and the risk of conflict increases. In that context, the increased military spending veers towards an arms race with greater potential for destruction. I started with the military domain, at least in terms of defense spending. I should proceed, I think. I was going to ask, can somebody check on that? I started with the military domain, at least in terms of defense spending, but trade, finance, and the economy are also vital domains that facilitate stability. From the perspective of ASEAN member states and Asia, the last 30 years have seen unparalleled economic growth from globalization, largely championed by the US and fueled by China's economic growth. The IMF estimates that global economy tripled from 1990 to 2015, with nearly 1.5 billion people lifted out of extreme poverty in that period. And over 70% of the figure, 1.1 billion people, were in Asia alone. It is an economic miracle. And the people of Asia, particularly the poor, have benefited en masse from globalization. But today, a different geopolitical zeitgeist dominates, emanating from domestic politics, but inevitably spilling outwards. As a stark manifestation, the US is out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, now replaced by the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, and which instead China has applied to be part of. It is a significant change. The US, as the prime mover of globalization for the past 3 decades, with its various instruments and institutions, has changed tack. The Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership is another economic bloc of 15 Asian Pacific nations that collectively accounts for about 30% of global GDP, of which China, but not the US, is part of. More recently, the US launched the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework in 2022, with 14 participating countries, representing 40% of the world's GDP. It's an important initiative to anchor and sustain the US's economic interests in this region with other partners. Rising military spending, shifting military and trade alliances, and de facto nativist economic policies are strong winds of change. How do we weather the storms to come? For Asia and the wider Indo-Pacific region, the US-China relationship is central to stability. That is the core. But the penumbra of relationships of other countries outside this core is also important for stability. No country, I think, wants war. But our working assumptions and scenarios must be that unplanned incidents can occur. And as it did when the US Navy's EP-3 aircraft collided with the PLA Navy's fighter jet over Hainan in 2001, or the albeit accidental bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade in 1999. More recently, and as recent as yesterday, close encounters, some mere meters apart, have occurred between US and Chinese ships and planes on and over the South China Sea or Taiwan Straits. Channels of communication, both formal and informal, must exist so that when these unplanned incidents occur, those channels can be used to de-escalate and avoid conflict. Despite the Cold War, the Strategic Arms Limitation and the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaties were signed between Brezhnev and Nixon in 1972. During the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 too, President Kennedy's offer for a mutually acceptable compromise was delivered by then US Attorney General Robert Kennedy to Soviet Ambassador Drobinin. The salient point is that such channels of communications must be built over time. It will be too late to start or activate them only in moments of crisis. Seasoned diplomats compare unfavorably the lines of communication between the US and Soviet Union in the Cold War with what exists today between the US and China, now at its ebb. As recent as a decade ago, regular exchanges were conducted between American and Chinese officials at all levels. There was a US-China strategic and economic dialogue where ministers and top officials met every year to discuss both economic and security issues. The last SED took place in 2016. For their militaries then, the then chief of the PLA's General Staff Department, General Chen Ping-te, accepted an invitation to the US by then chairman of the US Joint Chiefs, Admiral Mike Mullen, in May of 2011, where he visited several US military bases and defense institutions. The PLA Navy was invited to participate in the US's RIMPAC naval exercise in 2014 and 2016. Those activities have all ceased. The last time their defense ministers visited each other's countries was in 2018. It's not our place, and certainly not my intention, to comment on the diplomatic efforts of other countries. But I state these observations on declining touch points between the American and Chinese military establishments, knowing full well that Singapore and other ASEAN states are not disinterested bystanders. Both the US and China have said that they do not want our countries, ASEAN countries, to take sides. But ASEAN member states with a vivid recollection of great power rivalry in our past and the devastating consequences are acutely concerned that worsening relationships between these two powers, US and China, will inevitably force difficult choices upon our individual states. Last year at the Shangri-La Dialogue, the US and China defense establishments did discuss the need to maintain open lines of communication. A hotline between Beijing and Washington was set up in 2008 between defense establishments, though rarely used. When unplanned incidents occur, that line of communication could make a crucial difference in the de-escalation of hostilities. For ASEAN, both through bilateral ties and individual member states and collectively with the US and China, through the ADMM+, we have sought inclusivity and engagement as key platforms for preemption and confidence building. Within the ADMM framework, we continue to pursue multilateral exercises that involve all our 8+ partners. These interactions strengthen practical cooperation, like the Code for Unplanned Encounters at Sea, to reduce the risk of accidents and miscalculations. Through the ADMM Plus Expert Working Group, over 20 exercises have been conducted in the past decade, despite differences and disagreements among countries. At the heart of our engagements, as fully exemplified at the Shangri-La Dialogue, is that desire to seek peace, even as we security chiefs strengthen our militaries to protect our individual nations. At times, the progress seems painfully slow, but we owe it to our citizens and the next generation to persist and forge breakthroughs. The adage applies: to whom much is given, much is expected. The people whom we serve expect us as leaders, influencers, movers, and shakers, the people here, to deal with security challenges and keep them from harm's way. That phrase has been repeated so often that I'm worried that we might become inured. So let me share one quick anecdote to humanize that expectation. We have more than 600 delegates here, but it takes thousands more to make sure that over the last few days things works smoothly. I know that you will want me to thank on all our behalves the police, the security troops, your liaison officers, the IISS staff, the transport and serving staff of the hotel, and we thank them all. After each Shangri-La Dialogue, it's become a habit for me to actually meet some of them, some of the staff, to thank them personally. Some of the hotel staff here, in fact, because this is an established hotel, have attended every Shangri-La since inception. They have grown old with us, or at least with me. They feel part of Shangri-La Dialogue. They go home to their families, tell them they were part of something important. Between plates of food and drinks of wine, they hear words: the Ukraine conflict, the South China Sea, rivalry. They whisper to their friends in hushed terms. They believe that what we do here can make a difference, even that of peace or war. They hope that by providing good service, it will help our discussions along. Are their great expectations reasonable or realistic of us and Shangri-La dialogue? How can mere words stop steel and fire? What else do we have if not words? Meeting like with like simply escalates. Realistic, reasonable or not, we owe those who serve, people like those who have served us these past 3 days, as leaders to secure peace through dialogue. In that hope, I wish all of you a safe journey back and hope to see you here for future Shangri-La dialogues. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister Ung, for that strategic statement, so typical of the Singaporean cast of mind. And might I just add one point, Minister, you just on stage navigated with assurance through a thunderstorm. And it is that form of strategic calm that needs to be maintained for regional stability. We have 25 minutes or so to go. We have a lot of people who wish the floor. My proposal is that each of those make their interventions, and I will give a couple of minutes each to the panelists to answer in the order in which they originally spoke. So with that, could I first invite from India, Ambika Vishwana.
Thank you, Dr. Chipman. Given that there's a thunderstorm outside, my question might be a little bit relevant. The president from Timor-Leste talked about water, sanitation, health, climate, and the deputy prime minister from Cambodia also touched upon climate change. So my question is, one, to the deputy prime minister on what more would he like to see from other partners in this region and from European partners and other Western partners in terms of what can be done to advance cooperation, given that this is what we're talking about in this last session. And on the other side of that, to the Deputy Prime Minister from Australia, your government currently places a lot of importance on human and environment security, and Australia has done quite a lot in terms of looking at climate in its neighborhood. But what can we see more from Australia in bringing those examples and your experience to the wider region of Southeast Asia, South Asia, and also then the Western Indian Ocean? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hannah Sheelist.
Thank you very much. I have a question to the Cambodian Deputy Prime Minister. 30% of Ukrainian territories are mined due to the Russian shelling and mining. Most of these are agricultural lands from where grains are coming to Asia and Africa. At the same time, the Cambodian Ministry of Foreign Affairs recently de facto excused themselves, almost being ashamed that they trained with Japanese money Ukrainian deminers, and emphasized that they are ready to train Russian military and that they have strategic relations with the Russian Federation that they would like to develop for the whole ASEAN. Don't you think that in such circumstances, your statements about peace and peaceful relations sounds a little bit as the diplomatic cover rather than the sincere belief in the important issues for the humanitarian issues during the war?
Reinhard Butifuker.
Thank you, Dr. Chipman. I have two questions to Minister Marles. I assume, Minister, that you agree that cooperative security also needs a reliable economic dimension. Minister Ung just forcefully argued in that respect. How do you see this? Shouldn't we all send a clear message to the United States that they cannot hold on to their stabilizing role in the Indo-Pacific without a better economic and trade offer to the region? And my second question, also to you, sir, why has Australia argued publicly that Taiwan's ambitions of possibly joining CPTPP would not be successful even before Taiwan publicly stated such plans?
Thank you. And from the Philippines, Meli Caballero Anthony.
Thank you. It's heartening to note that many speakers of the panel talk about the importance of institutions. And in particular, I note that the minister from Australia has mentioned the East Asia Summit, something that an institution that I hardly heard about during this meeting. So my question is, what more can we expect from an institution that actually brings together both China and the United States and the other important partners of the region? Isn't the EAS an institution that has not stand up to the expectation? Thank you.
And from Cambodia, Shengor Aun.
Thank you. My question go to Samdech Pichai, the Deputy Prime Minister of Cambodia. Samdech, I have two questions. First is Cambodia government previous position also highlight the priority to respect Cambodia's sovereign ownership of the Ream naval base. So I just heard you talk about transparency. How much transparency Cambodia can offer to reassure our neighbor and other countries in the region about the Ream naval base? Second is, I want to hear about your vision. How do you see as a vision to develop the Royal Cambodian Navy in the future to contribute to regional peace and maritime security? Thank you.
Thank you. Aaron Connolly.
Thank you, Dr. Chipman. Deputy Prime Minister Banh, your counterpart, Deputy Prime Minister Marles, suggested in his speech that the Quad could play a complementary role to ASEAN. I just wonder if you agree, and if so, what that role would look like. Thank you.
And from Indonesia, Fitriani.
Thank you. To General Banh, I would like to ask, to what extent is it possible, on what prerequisite, that ASEAN may form and deploy its regional peacekeeper to tackle sub-regional conflicts, such as perhaps Myanmar, and to whether the ASEAN Plus mechanism will be invited to join the force, or because of the non-intervention principle, such action might not be feasible before the ASEAN Charter is reviewed and revised. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And from China, Xi Xiaozhu.
Thank you very much. And I'd like to ask two questions, perhaps related with each other. In last session, we talked about NATO's role in the world security resolution. And as a traditional military organization, that NATO has failed to prevent the regional wars. We talk a lot about the Russia-Ukraine military conflicts. And if we trace back that NATO once launched the bombing campaign and destroyed the former Yugoslavia. And such tensions still continue till today. And my question goes to the ministers. And with the NATO look on China as the systematic competitor or rivalry, and have the plan to open office in Japan. And will the ASEAN leaders will worry about the over-intervention by such outsider organization into Asia-Pacific will create more conflicts, especially and the heavy pressure from big power. My second question goes to Deputy Minister, Prime Minister Marles, that you talk about the small organizations like Quad, AUKUS, and the other organizations. And you have told us that such organization will not generate the negative influence. And how do you give us reassurance about its trend, especially and more and more pressure from the big power competition? Thank you.
Thank you. And from the Philippines, Jeffrey Ordonel.
Thank you. I'd like to address my question to Minister Marles and Minister Ng. The United States plays an important role in the security of the Indo-Pacific region, but the Russian invasion of Ukraine has prompted some debates among experts and academics here in the region about what the United States should prioritize. On the one side, they argue that the Ukraine-Russia war is a distraction for the United States from its supposed priority theater, which is the Indo-Pacific region, in particular those that relates to US resources being devoted to Ukraine. On the other side of the debate, the argument is Ukraine is not a distraction because Russian victory could weaken the credibility of American commitments elsewhere in the world and could make Indo-Pacific states rethink their reliance on the United States on security. As important security partners of the United States in this region, I wonder where you stand in this debate and what would you prefer the United States do? Thank you.
Thank you. And from the UK, Robert Ward.
Thank you, John. A question for all the panelists, please. We've heard much at this dialogue about the significant changes underway in Japan with regard to its defense policy and Japan's increased focus on regional security. Is Japan doing enough, and where would you like to see Japan doing more? Thank you.
Thank you. And I'll just, I think, take one more. Ben Schreier from Germany.
Thank you, John. A question on AUKUS for Deputy Prime Minister Richard Marles. There's now a clear pathway for Pillar 1 of AUKUS to deliver the nuclear-powered submarine for Australia, but there seems less clarity on Pillar 2, and in particular on how to engage possibly trusted partners in and outside the region. So I would like to hear some thoughts, if possible, on Australia's emerging thinking on Pillar 2 and whether and how to engage other partners. Thank you.
I think actually I will take one more in deference to an individual who played quite some role in organizing a number of Shangri-La dialogues. So the last question from the floor, Tim Huxley.
Thank you, John. My question is for Richard Marles. Minister, I was very interested in your mention of what you referred to as a lack of transparency in China's military programs, and I wondered if you could just say a little bit more about that lack of transparency. Which aspects of China's military programs strike you as worryingly opaque, and is there a model or standard for military transparency that you would like to see China and the PLA apply? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So I think there's enough there for 3 or 4 minutes each. Deputy Prime Minister, might you answer the 2 or 3 questions principally posed to you? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I think I can explain maybe not all of this question, but I will explain the major part of it. Related to the climate change, we all know and we are very aware because of the publicity and all the information that is disseminated from the media, and we all have paid attention to this issue. But I think it's related to the advanced industrial country, because this is the main source of the greenhouse gases. And therefore, we focus not just on natural disaster, but also the climate change because of the man-made pollution. Related to the Ukraine issue, I have met the Minister of Defense of Ukraine, and we have discussed several issues, and I have maintained our clear position that we have some experience, especially related to demining. So related to demining, we have the capability to provide some training as well as to provide some work if there is any demand or request under the umbrella of the United Nations, just as we have done in many places regarding demining. Another issue regarding the Ream Naval Base, I have always clarified all the time that this is the requirement to enhance our capability in order to participate in cooperation. At the same time, this is also about our enhancement capability in the maritime domain, and therefore we need a proper basis so that we have a chance in order to develop our navy in order to protect our sovereignty. In fact, our Ream Naval Base is just a small base, and it's not even equal in terms of size to some civilian port in other country. So I think even if there is some transparency, we will provide transparency, but certainly this will not affect the security in the region. And basically, instead, if we succeeded in modernization, we will be able to participate in activities in the region in order to increase security in the region. So this is what I want to say about the transparency regarding the Ream Naval Base. And I have always clarified that whatever we have done, it will always follow our constitution and effective law in our country. Of course, there are people who said that our base is open for foreign troops, and this will not happen. So please do not interpret it in any different way. And another question, I think it's a little bit difficult to explain regarding the relation between Quad and ASEAN. I think this is also an interesting issue that we have always pay attention to, just like Cambodia. If all of these organizations are created for the cause of peace, security, and prosperity in the region, we will have nothing to stop it. And we actually have to congratulate it. However, if it negatively affect some of the problem, or it will negatively affect stability in the region or create any arms race, then that will be another issue, and which I think we will have to find a way in order to discuss. Thank you very much for the question, and these are my answers. Thank you.
Richard Marles.
Thanks, John. So I'll do my best to go through those questions. Well, but again, following on from the Deputy Prime Minister, I don't guarantee that I'll get to all of them. Let me start with the question from our friends from China, which started in relation to NATO. I mean, firstly, I wouldn't accept the characterization of NATO's contribution within Europe. I think in the aftermath of the Second World War and two world wars taking place on that continent in a relatively short period of time, I think there's a different interpretation of NATO about the contribution that it's made in respect of European and North Atlantic peace since 1945. But I think the real essence of that question was whether or not NATO is in some form being exported into the Indo-Pacific, and it is not. You know, from Australia's point of view, it is not. I can't make that clearer in terms of the way in which we see our engagement in the region and the way in which we see our engagement in various organisations which I described within the region. And that was the second part of the question, which went to those smaller organisations, and again I take it as a reference to AUKUS and to the Quad, and how Australia can provide strategic reassurance to the region. I mean, the first answer to that is by getting on the phone and speaking, and by coming to events like this and talking, and being as completely clear as we could be about what it is that we are on about. And I think our record over the last 12 months speaks for itself. AUKUS is a technology transferring arrangement. It is not an alliance. It is, in the immediate term, through Pillar 1, a mechanism by which Australia can acquire a nuclear-powered submarine capability, and what we seek to do with that capability, we have made really clear to the region and to the world, and that is to play our part in providing for the collective security of the region and the maintenance of the global rules-based order within the region. Understanding that Australia today, by virtue of the growing contribution that trade makes to our national wealth, has a huge connection to the world, and there's a physical dimension to that, and that connection comes through Southeast Asia, East Asia, through the Indo-Pacific. And it is protecting our connection to the world and making our contribution to regional security and the global rules-based order, which is why we seek to develop the defence capabilities that we do, and AUKUS is simply a means by which we acquire capability. To just divert for a moment, to go on to one of the questions from Germany in relation to AUKUS Pillar 2, I certainly understand the observation that's made in relation to Pillar 2. Understandably, there has been a focus in respect of submarines, but we do see AUKUS in a broader sense of being an opportunity to work with the United States and the United Kingdom on developing cutting-edge technologies. And as we walk further down the track, as we've said a number of occasions, we imagine that may well be a construct which might apply to other countries as well, but I think there is a way to go in relation to the three of our countries working together on AUKUS Pillar 2 before we get to that point. To come back to the second question of our Chinese friends, or the second part of that question, which is then in respect to the Quad. The Quad is not a security organisation. The Quad is about practical engagement, and we've been talking together with our Quad partners, for example, in relation to coordinating on development assistance. And so it is not about a security pact either. Giving strategic reassurance to the region about what those entities, as two examples, are about, is about standing up and actually explaining to people what we seek to do with in our membership of those organisations and what we are about. There was a question from Tim from the UK about my comments in respect of a lack of transparency in respect of China and where we see the kind of standard here as applying. It really goes from the comments that I've just made. Our issue is, I mean, there is a very significant build-up that we are seeing with China in terms of its military. It is the lack of a strategic explanation for what that's for and what that is about. And if you want the standard, I mean, others can judge whether we meet the standard, but what we seek to do is aspire to a standard where we make clear to the region and the world what we are on about in terms of the capabilities that we have and why we're developing them. And I guess that's what we would seek from others. There was a question from a Philippines delegate in relation to the Ukraine and whether this is, how does it relate to the Indo-Pacific and US engagement, I guess, in the Indo-Pacific. I think the answer to that question is simply that the relevance of the Ukraine to the Indo-Pacific, but the relevance of the war in Ukraine to the world is about the fact that this is a war where the global rules-based order is on trial. I mean, that's what's engaged here. That's why we see it relating to Australia's national interest. I mean, what happened with the Russian invasion of Ukraine is a complete breach of the rules-based order, where a large neighbour invades a smaller neighbour, not by reference to the rule of law, but by reference to power and might. And that can't be allowed to stand in the world today in Europe or in the Indo-Pacific. And so that's what's at issue there. There was a question from the UK about Japan and its role. I think what I'd say there is that the National Defence Strategy of Japan that they released in December of last year, I think is a welcome statement from Japan about its desire to engage more in the region and to play its part in the world. And I think the degree to which, and there is an expression in that document about a Japanese interest in regional security and them playing their part in that. And I think the conversation that we're seeing between Japan and Korea, given their history, is a really potent example of it, is really welcome from our point of view in terms of that country, and in Korea for that matter, playing their part in the maintenance of the rules-based order as well. There was a question then in relation, again from the Philippines, in relation to the East Asian Summit. We do think, for the reasons that was expressed in the questioner's question about the East Asian Summit bringing together China and America, we do feel that it is a really important piece of regional architecture, and from an Australian point of view, we will continue to engage in it. There was then a question early on from the European Union delegate in relation to the kind of economic piece in respect of security. Completely agree with that too. I mean, we need to be thinking about global security and rules, not just through the lens of defence, but through all elements of statecraft. And we must see, I mean, we see trade as a positive development. It's not I think the lesson from Ukraine is trade does not preclude war, but trade is a good thing of itself in terms of the economic development of the globe, which is an important factor in removing tensions which give rise to conflict. And yes, in respect of America, we were disappointed that America pulled out of the TPP. We welcome the fact that America has put forward IPEF, but we are consistent advocates to America about their need, not just in a security sense, but in an economic sense, to play their part in the world. And I think that's an important piece of advocacy that we can all do in respect of America there. Finally, there was a question in relation to climate change and the Pacific and the region, and beyond that in the Indian Ocean. Under our government, I hope the world has seen a change in Australian posture in respect of climate change. Certainly there has been a fundamental change in Australia, where we are now on a credible pathway to net zero emissions by 2050, and that's a significant commitment from Australia given our history of emission. And I think where the world should take comfort actually in terms of what Australia is doing is that it's really clear, to me at least, that it's going to be difficult for any party to govern Australia in the future unless they have a credible answer to the question about how Australia will meet being a net zero emitter by 2050. But we think that there is a role in respect of our place in the world in terms of advocacy. Part of it actually is telling the story of particularly small Pacific Island countries, coral atoll nations like the Marshall Islands, Kiribati, Tuvalu, who really are on the front line of climate change in a kind of visceral way, which is hard for a lot of us to understand unless you've been there and seen it. And I think to tell their story to the world about the impact of climate change on people today, and it's not to say they are uniquely on the front line. I think there are, a country like Bangladesh, Ganges River Delta, they're very much on the front line as well. So there is stories around the world which need to be told, but it is the collection of those stories which will see the real motive for action here. And that is in part why we have sought to host COP31 in the coming years, and to make that located in the Pacific so that we are able to very much tell their story to the world.
Thank you very much. Minister Ung, you have a parting thought?
There were two quick questions, some related, I think, by Colonel Chu, Mr. Ordenil, that relate to Europe and Asia, and the impact of, as Richard has said, the Ukraine war on us, and whether countries, especially the US, have got adequate resources. Our starting point is, as we've stated publicly, that the US presence in this part of the world we consider as vital and for stability. And that's the reason for our MOU, in which we facilitate US ships and planes through our bases. But that question presupposes that a superpower or a number of superpowers can have the resources to handle both a conflict in Europe and Asia. And that, as I've said, is a catastrophic outcome which we must do everything to avoid. And not only on our military organizations, it will have impact on civilians, realliances, just the world as we know at large. So that's quite clear. There has been a recurring theme from a number of speakers that whether you bring NATO in the region or you bring US out of the region, that part of the problem is who goes into which region. And a call, if you like, Mr. Lee addressed this some years ago, I remember, and in his, Lee Kuan Yew, in his artful way said, well, if you ask the Chinese, they might prefer a dividing line around Guam, where the Chinese keep to the west side of Guam and the US keep to the east side of Guam. He didn't say that they wanted it, he just said that he observed that there might be the preferred view. First, it's unrealistic for that to happen. The US will not go away, and neither will China go away. Two, even if that occurred, we've gone back to great power rivalry, but just defined by spheres. And we know the outcome of that in World War I. Because once you cross the line, you bring all the spheres into collision. So I think it's an unrealistic expectation that if ships and planes of any one military fly in another part of the world, then that means you're aggressive. Of course, I can imagine the PLA say, well, how would the US feel if I flew around Hawaii or the west coast of US? I'm not suggesting to the PLA to do that, but I'm just saying for fullness of debate, that might be the response. Mr. Ward had a question of Japan. What more would, if from the ASEAN member state and from Singapore's point of view, would say to Japan they would do? In my mind, the single most important thing that Japan can do for the stability of ASEAN in Asia is to improve their relations with China. Unlike Germany, which, and publicly we've said that Japan can do more for security in this region, and we said it thoughtfully. Some have said, was there a change in position? Because previously we said Japan was a self-defense force. Not really. We facilitate Japanese ships through our Changi naval bases. But it was eloquently demonstrated in the previous plenary. I thought it was a surreal moment listening to German Minister Boris Pistorius espousing the values of the post-World War II values, which was completely different from pre-World War II Germany, about the right of power against the right of small states, about the principles that we should follow. And Prime Minister Kallas acknowledging that Germany had a moment of accounting. I say this not to sensitize or to lay any blame, or I'm just stating the facts, that there is still a residual feeling among ASEAN member states and Asia that there is no similar accounting post-World War II vis-a-vis Japan. Japan has done very much in the past decades to reassure their neighbors. So I would summarize this as this. First, Japan's greatest task is to improve their relations with China. I worry more about Northeast Asia than I do South China Sea. Second, they should do more to reassure, as they have been doing in the past decades, of Japan's militarization and growth. And third, that they should continue to participate as they have ably been done in multilateral settings. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister. this gives me a few minutes to offer my own words of thanks and also to help us all look forward to more Shangri-La dialogues. First, the vote of thanks to all of our panelists here. So let's ensure they all receive that thanks now. And then, of course, it's my pleasure to offer my thanks to the IISS staff here in IISS Asia, led with admirable energy by James Crabtree and the many other people in that office that have both communicated with other defense ministers in the region and helped support the extraordinary logistic challenge of this dialogue. And also the staff that have come from the IISS headquarters in the UK, of which there are many, both analysts and, crucially, as important operators. Staff from IISS Europe in Berlin, IISS Americas in Washington, and IISS Middle East in Bahrain. All of them have helped to ensure that there is the diversity of participation that we've seen here. Just a few statistics, because we're all data-centric people. We did, in fact, have exactly 571 delegates. In order to support them, we needed to print 4,738 badges. We had 1,679 officials and security. Of the ones we were able to count, we knew that there were 121 bilaterals that formally took place, and happily there were some accidental diplomatic encounters that we know will be productive in the future. And there were 54 nationalities represented here, 34 full ministers, and a huge complement of other senior government officials. It's also my great pleasure and honor to thank the staff of the Istana, the staff of the Prime Minister's Office, the Ministry of Defense of Singapore, the Minister himself, the Permanent Secretary, and all of his senior officials. Of course, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the police, and the other security officials that have helped us proceed, to use a phrase I used only 15 minutes ago or so, with strategic calm. I have also been to all 20 Shangri-La dialogues. As I said last Friday night, I started it in 2002. It's important sometimes to do things that are totally unprecedented. It's important sometimes completely to innovate, and one has to do both with a degree of emotional intelligence and proper humility. And that was the attitude we brought to the first, and we developed over the subsequent 19 years sufficient confidence in the International Institute for Strategic Studies' ability to preside over an international gathering with diplomatic serenity that we now have so many people with us today. I haven't actually made a precise count, but I think I've chaired slightly over 130 plenaries in that time. It has been a very signal honor and one of my proudest achievements to have initiated this event, which, if it had not been initiated, might have needed to be invented. I was glad to have played a role in inventing it. I might also just add, as an historic point, that I became the Director General and Chief Executive of the IISS. In fact, I was slightly more modestly styled the Director of ISS in 1 October 1993. And then once we began establishing a number of offices around the world, and each of them had directors, the trustees in their wisdom decided that they had to double style me, both Director General and Chief Executive. And that they did about 12 years or so ago. So it's for that reason that I have this magnificent title. At the IISS, we have learned a great deal from our engagement with Singapore as we've understood your political culture, and to a degree we've ever so slightly borrowed from it in developing our own succession strategy, where the decision taken is that there will not be a succession event, but an execution of a proper and intelligent succession strategy. So on the 1st of October 2023, when I will have completed exactly 30 years as Director and then Director General and Chief Executive, I will become the Executive Chair of the IISS, spending 50% of my time at the IISS, but as I said last night at the Astana, paid and therefore accountable still, and help to maintain the altitude and operational tempo without missing a step or skipping a beat that the IISS is famous for. One might in Singaporean parlance, but I don't want to have ideas above my station. Think of it as a type of minister, mentor role. We did have a global competition for the next Director General and Chief Executive. He happily will be styled with all of the attributes that I was lucky enough to gain. And after a global competition, we were delighted to have been able to choose an exceptional internal candidate, familiar with the Institute's strategic culture and able to operate collegially within it. Now, I'm going to just open and close a parenthesis and say, all of you know that the IISS is a global leader in the generation of military data. All of you know that the IISS is a global leader in geopolitical analysis. All of you know that the IISS is a global leader in convening defense and security officials who might not so easily be able to convene themselves. But the IISS, and you'll understand why I say this in 30 seconds, is also a global leader in seating plans, intelligently marrying process to style and protocol to decorum. To my left, I have two individuals. To his right, he has two individuals. He is seated exactly opposite me, so I would like to invite the next Director General and Chief Executive of the IISS, Baskin Gigerich, to stand. He will be chairing the next Shangri-La Dialogue in the first weekend of June. And with that, I invite you all, first of all, to take lunch and then to have a safe journey home. See you next year. Thank you.